My name is Emma Carter, and I was 26 when the thing that happened to me started to rearrange everything I thought I understood about trust and truth and who I was when the lights were off and the city was quiet. I lived in Austin, a small apartment above a taco place on South Congress, the kind of place where you could smell lime and grilled onions through the screen door and the live music would pulse against the walls like a distant heart. I worked as a junior project manager at a small tech startup near the Domain. I was careful and hardworking and stubborn in a way my mother used to scold me for. I had been saving for a trip to New Orleans, and I liked to run along Lady Bird Lake on Sundays when the air was soft. My boyfriend then was Michael Hayes. He had moved to Austin for college and stayed. He wore his hair a little long and could disarm you with a crooked smile. He worked in sales at a mid-sized software company downtown, and he was good at turning a conversation into an agreement. He liked craft beer and the worn leather of his dad's old jacket. He trusted easily and liked people in a way that softened their rough edges right in front of him. I thought I knew him. We had been together for 3 years. We lived together in a narrow duplex in East Austin. We shared a small couch that smelled faintly of his cologne and a coffee table packed with our histories in the form of paperback books with notes in the margins. We had plans that felt like a scaffolding for the rest of our lives. On the Tuesday before the Friday that would change everything we had argued about something small, I can no longer remember the exact words. A misunderstanding about his schedule and a text left unread. He held my hand the way he always did after an argument and said sorry in that tone he used when he meant it. I believed him. On Friday, he told me he had a surprise. He was nervous in a way I had only seen when he asked me to move in months before. He had that clumsy smile, and he kept checking his pockets, as if making sure the world had not slipped out of his grasp. We went to dinner at a small bistro that smelled of rosemary and lemon, and the servers knew his name because he had a habit of befriending waiters. After dinner, we walked along South Lamar, under a sky stripped of clouds. He stopped in front of a fountain at Republic Square, and said he wanted to say something in a way that made my heart accelerate like I was standing on the edge of a high place. He took my hands. He looked at me like I mattered more than anything else in the world. He said, "Emma, I want to spend the rest of my life with you." He reached into his jacket, and I thought I knew what would happen next. He unfolded a small velvet box and opened it with a serious face, and the ring caught the light, and for a suspended breath the world was only the two of us and the faint hiss of the fountain. He asked me to marry him, and in that exact second, I imagined a kitchen with sunlight and a dog and my name on his lips in the mornings. I said yes. I said it without thinking, and I meant it in a way that was a small, honest shout from a place that had learned to be careful. People who hear about engagement moments imagine slow motion and music. For us, it was all too real and sharp. We laughed and we kissed and we made promises in the way people do when they assume promises are easy. We called my mother, and she cried and said congratulations like the world had rearranged itself into something kinder. He said we should tell our families Sunday when we flew to Houston for his cousin's wedding. He said this with the kind of certainty I had come to rely on. The last line he said before we went to bed was, "I love you, and when I fell asleep I believed him the way you believe the sun. We'll rise in the morning." On Saturday morning he left early to take care of some work calls, and I was still floating on the afterglow of the previous night. It felt like the beginning of something steady and glowing. I cleaned the apartment because I like things in order when my future seems previously decided. I went to a bridal boutique just to look at dresses in the window, a silly impulse. A private smile meant only for me. I called a friend and we drank coffee and talked about nothing of consequence. I bought flowers on the way home because small rituals feel important when everything else is big. He texted me that afternoon with a series of sweet messages and a picture of dinner reservations he had made at our bistro for Sunday night after the wedding. The words he sent felt like a map of things to come. I folded the bouquet into a jar and wrote little notes and stuck them on the fridge. I slept badly that night because excitement has the same effect on me as a fever. On Sunday morning, I woke to a dozen missed calls and a message from his sister that read, "Call me now." The world tightened like a fist. I called and she said, "Are you watching the news?" And I said, "What news?" And she said, "Michael just got married," and I heard her voice like someone else speaking through a tunnel. She said it like this could be some mistake, an unfortunate headline. I thought perhaps a joke, an elaborate prank. I called Michael and his phone went to voicemail. I kept calling until my hands felt like they were burning. I texted him and wrote, "Where are you?" and the reply came in a way that had no rhythm at all, a simple photo. The photo was of Michael standing on an old courthouse lawn in downtown Austin. He wore a suit, a tie, and something in his face that did not belong to the man who had proposed to me 2 days before. He was smiling in the picture, and beside him was a woman in a white dress, and in her hands a bouquet. The caption read, "Just married," and there was a string of small, gleeful emojis. My stomach dropped and I could hear the blood like thunder in my ears. I stood in my apartment holding that image and could not make sense of it. I stared at the ring in the jar where I had placed it, and suddenly the ring felt like a small bright stone on a map that no longer led anywhere. I took my keys and walked to his office because my head makes bad decisions when my limbs want proof. I arrived and the receptionist said he had left early for his cousin's wedding in Houston. And I said, "But he said he was coming back," and she looked at me like I had come to the wrong movie. I left and went straight to the courthouse where the picture had been taken, and it was real, the banner of the courthouse, its bricks, and a small crowd leaving the building. I asked someone, a young man with a clipboard, and he said 2 people got married an hour ago, and they looked happy. I remember the detergent smell of someone passing by, and the sound of a car horn. I felt like I was watching the edges of a photograph come apart. I called his sister again, and she said, "It is true, he married her. Her name is Claire, and she has been working with him on a charity project, and they got close, and they left tonight for a honeymoon." She said it like a fact, and I wanted to ask her, why not me? Why 2 days after, but my voice said nothing. I called his mother, and she said, "Emma, I think you should sit down," and I sat on the curb with the world tilting. She told me that Michael had met Claire 3 months ago on a volunteer trip, and that they had been seeing each other in a way we kept private. I kept asking in pieces. Why did he ask me? Why would he do this? And the answers came as flinty facts and partial explanations like, "You did not know," she said, and I thought I had known him. And then I realized how much of a person can be a set of habits and how little of a person you can really touch. I stood up and walked, and the city felt empty in a new way. I remembered the tiny things that had seemed unimportant, a name left unsaid, a text unanswered, a hesitancy in the voice that I had explained away as tiredness rather than a fissure. I wanted to find the woman in the white dress so I could see her face and understand how she fit into this sudden geometry. I found out later that Claire was 28, a consultant from Houston who had moved to Austin 6 months earlier. She had the kind of resume that read like a dozen invitations. She volunteered at the same charity Michael had been helping. She wore her hair in a loose bun and had a way of looking like the camera loved her. When I saw pictures of the ceremony online later, people had smiled in a way the camera cannot lie about, and Michael looked like a man who had made a public choice. My phone filled with messages from friends and work and strangers, and everyone wanted to know if I was okay. I was not. I sat for a long time on my couch and let the TV mutter like a distant tide. I called my mother and she said, "Come home, I will make you soup." And my mom's voice was the first safe thing I had left. I lost a week of work to a thin fog of shock and calls, and things I had to do like closing the joint account and taking my things out of our shared closet. People said terrible things softly like, maybe he was confused, maybe it was some impulsive thing. I felt the old tidy rules of how life should run unravel. My friends came over and we drank and watched old movies that made sense because they had beginnings and ends that I could hold. I remember Sophia, my closest friend, grinding coffee and saying, "You do not deserve this," and her hands were steady. I wanted to ask Michael for an explanation, but every time I imagined him in his suit beside a woman in white, the image tore me open again. I wanted the truth. I wanted to understand whether my last month had been a lie, whether the memory of his hands fitting around mine was a memory of someone else. I did what people do when they cannot rest. I collected evidence. I checked his social media and found images of him and Claire from months before pictures that had not been public when he proposed. There were captions that I had not seen and comments that read like private scaffolding. I scrolled through old messages that were saved on our shared laptop and found a string of texts between him and Claire that read like an arranging of a future that had not included me. There was the sting of betrayal, but also the hollowing realization that I had been allowed to believe in something he was quietly stepping away from. I felt foolish and angry and humiliated. I imagined the ring in my hand like a bright coin I had been tricked into showing. The worst part was not just that he had married her. It was that everything in the middle, the small acts, the intimacy, the late-night confessions seemed to have been minimized. I typed his name into search bars and found an article about a small charity event where both of them had been photographed laughing together weeks before. I wanted to confront him. I wanted to march up to the venue where the reception would be and demand answers in front of his family, but the thought of a spectacle felt like feeding more coin to the part of him that had already chosen a different life. I thought and thought about what would make me feel like I existed again. I thought about leaving town and erasing every corner of Austin that smelled like him. I thought about forgiveness and the way it felt like giving up a precious thing. I thought about humiliation and whether I wanted to punish someone for how they had chosen to live. The city kept moving, the startup asked me back, and my boss offered me a deadline extension because they could see my hands still trembled. Weeks passed and the wound did not close. I went to therapy, and I learned to name things and hold them and break them into manageable pieces. But the memory of that image of them on the courthouse steps kept replaying, and with each replay my anger refined itself into a shape. It became more than the initial blow. It became about something else: fairness and the right to not be disposable. I began to listen carefully to the small ways he had explained things away. The sudden calls to work on a Friday that meant long text breaks, the little ritual of not planning too far ahead whenever conversations drifted toward the future. I began to see what had been hidden in plain sight. I wanted to be loud enough to change his future, not just whisper at him in the dark. I started to watch his life from a distance, not because I wanted to torture myself, but because it became a way to gather facts. I drove by the office where he worked and took note of his hours. I learned the route he drove to his parents' house and the coffee shop he favored. I wrote down the charities he mentioned and the names of people who showed up in pictures. I kept records like someone running a ledger of wrongs. My friends thought I was losing myself, and Sophia said, "Emma, do not let this eat you," and I nodded. I began to plan, because action is at least a way to steel yourself against being a passive object in someone else's story. I did not want petty acts. I wanted something that would cut to the core and make it impossible for him to step back into the life he had with me as if nothing had happened. I wanted something that would make public what he had kept private. I rented a car for a weekend and drove to Houston to find Claire. I sat in a coffee shop on Westheimer and watched her leave a building with a laptop bag and a smile, and I followed. This is the part that feels messy because following someone is heavy with moral weight. I kept my distance. I did not touch her. I watched how she moved through the city and how the world seemed to fit her shoulders. I wanted to know who she was. Beyond the white dress and the smiling photos, I learned her name fully: Claire Thompson. She was 32, not 28 as I had been told. She worked as a consultant for a nonprofit, and she had a brother who lived in New Orleans. I watched the way she texted Michael a little too often for the wife of a man who had proposed 2 days before. I learned the story of how they had met on a volunteer trip, and how the lines had blurred, and how she had believed something different than I had. When I confronted her over coffee, she said, "Emma, what are you doing here?" And she had no apology in her face, only surprised defense. And I remember the taste of the bitter coffee and the heat of tears that wanted to come and would not. I told her everything, and she said I did not know, and then she said we were in love, and there was no easy answer. And when she said that, I felt my hand tighten around my phone until my nails hurt. She told me she loved him, and I listened and thought about how love can live in 2 people at once, but not always with the same rules. She called him to explain why I was there, and I heard his voice on the speaker, calm and collected, and telling me to leave. Claire said he wanted to talk, and I left. That night, I sat and thought about how the most painful betrayals are sometimes not crafted from malice alone, but from a human hunger that mistakes closure for commitment. I was filled with a terrible clarity, and also a cold, hard sense of humor about the play of appearances. If he wanted to erase me, he had failed because I was still here, and I could use the one currency that still mattered to me, which was truth. I began to gather everything that would make his choice visible. I collected screenshots of his public images and saved messages that showed a pattern, and I compiled a timeline. I reached out to people who had been at the events where he and Claire had been seen together and asked small questions. I did not lie. I asked about dates and photographs and the names of hotels where they had stayed. I built a record because if you want to change how a story is told, you must first change the facts that appear in the story. I found out something else that made the plan possible. Michael had been working on a mid-level promotion at his company, and he was courting some new clients. He had been building a public persona of stability, which matters when you sell trust. I found out that one of the people he needed to impress was hosting a large donor gala at the W Hotel in Austin, and that Claire had been invited as a representative of her nonprofit. The gala would be photographed and the guest speakers would be names that could help him. He wanted to stand next to people who believed in his dependability. I saw then a way to reach not only him, but the people who had been nodding and saying good job in rooms where he hoped nothing from the past would matter. I bought a ticket to the gala, and I prepared. I wore a dress I would not have chosen before the whole thing. I wrote a speech in the bathroom of my apartment and practiced it in front of the mirror until I could say the words without my voice cracking. I called an old college friend who now wrote for a local lifestyle magazine, and I said, I have something you will need to hear, and she said, tell me, and I said, meet me at the W on Saturday. I am not proud of what I did in the way people are not proud of things they do to defend themselves. But I was also very aware of the line between making someone accountable and becoming the kind of person you hoped you would not be. I decided to let the truth be the instrument and the audience the judge. The night of the gala, the W hummed with chandeliers and the scrape of heels. The room smelled of perfume and expensive food. I stood by the bar and watched as Michael moved through the space in his suit, like a man who had practiced charm. He looked at me for a moment, and then smiled and moved on. Claire was there in a dress that caught the light. Cameras clicked. My friend from college found me and sat with me and said, "Are you sure?" And I said, "I'm sure." I had copies of the timeline printed and a folder of screenshots, and I had one other thing, a recording. I had, in a moment of private desperation, called a mutual friend who had done a lot of work with both Michael and Claire and asked if they had ever discussed the logistics of getting married quickly. And the friend had told me there had been talk about a courthouse ceremony to avoid attention and had even joked about a hasty wedding. The friend did not know what the picture would mean 2 nights after a proposal. She had provided enough to make the pattern clear. I asked my writer friend to sit near the head table. She had press credentials and a recorder, and she said I can do that. The plan was not to humiliate for sport. The plan was to make the story public in a way that would align the people who mattered with the facts. My writer friend stood when the host asked for a moment, and she said with enough authority that the room would listen, "I have a confession about one of the people on the stage," and then she told the story. She spoke about a man who had proposed to his girlfriend on Friday and in 2 days had been photographed married in a courthouse. She spoke the timeline and showed pictures and messages, and the room grew quiet, as if someone had drawn a curtain. I watched Michael's face as someone might watch a painting change under heat. He looked smaller. He looked like a man being removed from the place he had built with careful hands. Cameras turned and the crowd leaned in. People asked questions and my writer friend answered with documents. The man hosting the gala looked angry because his reputation now stood at a tilt. People who had been nodding at him stepped back. If humiliation was a tool, it worked quickly in a room like that, and yet there was a strange quiet that replaced the noise. Claire went pale, and then she moved toward Michael and said, "Emma, what are you doing here?" And her voice was sharp. Michael tried to speak, and his mouth made shapes that held no words. He turned to me and said, "Emma, you are making a scene," and in his voice, I heard the old dismissal, the same tone he had used when he wanted to close a conversation. I held my ground and said I said nothing to dramatize, but I have proof, and I have something to say to the people who believed in his story, and to the people he asked to trust him, and now you will have the choice to hear what happened. The host cut the feed to the after-party and asked us to leave. The talk ricocheted across social media because there was video, and people loved the sudden collapse of a polished image. The next day, the story was on local websites, and the company where Michael worked called him into a meeting and asked for answers. They were not interested in the private pain that had been inflicted. They were interested in whether the man they trusted to sign contracts had been honest about his life. His promotion was paused. His clients were called and some apologized to the company for the misunderstanding. I received messages and watched the slow unfolding with a detached part of myself that felt like witnessing a science experiment. I was not beyond feeling bad for what I had set into motion. People began to send me messages, thanking me for bringing truth into public view, and others called me cruel and asked why I had not simply walked away. Michael called me and left a message that said, "Emma, please stop," and that message was full of a new kind of pleading, a public man turned private and small. I thought about confronting him directly and realized he was already unmoored. There was a moment of silence where the consequences landed and something shifted in me. I did not dance on his ruin. I stood back and felt the rawness of every decision. I had wanted to be seen and heard, and when I had carved a space for that, it felt like a sharp instrument and also like a mirror. The company eventually decided not to keep him in his position because trust is a currency in his industry, and because he had presented two futures to two different people. People said he lost his job because of me, and in a way that was true. He had lost the security of a path he had been nurturing, and in losing it, he also lost the comfortable narrative he had been living. It did not make me feel victorious. It made me feel like someone who had arranged a reckoning and then had to live with what came after. In the end, he moved out of Austin and went to live with an uncle in another city. There were a few public statements and a few quiet private ones, and then a long silence. Claire left town too after the scandal. She found work elsewhere, and she sent me one message that said, "I am sorry," and another that said we thought we were doing the right thing. I kept my job, and in time I stopped feeling my chest tighten when I saw a courthouse on the news. The ring I kept for a while in a drawer, not because of sentiment, but because it served as proof of a truth I had lived through. I tossed it one night in a trash can behind my apartment building and watched it glint in the city light for a moment before disappearing into the dark. There is a strange peace that follows when things stop shifting. People asked me later if I forgave him, and I could not answer that easily, because forgiveness is a long, quiet room that I had not yet entered. I had traded a private hurt for public truth, and that trade had consequences I still felt when I lay awake at night. The end of the story is not about triumph in a way that is loud. It is about a woman who recovered enough of herself to make a choice that refused to be invisible. It is about a man who had to face the shape of his actions, and a woman who learned that sometimes to be seen, you must step into the bright place and let everyone look. In the last scene, I can see him walking away from the house. We had shared a packed U-Haul van and a friend carrying an old lamp. My favorite mug in a box, with the words Emma on the label in his handwriting, and I felt nothing like pity and nothing like glee. I felt the precise cold of a winter wind that wakes you up and tells you the truth about a home that no longer fits you. The file of documents I had made sits in a box in my closet, and sometimes I open it and look at the timeline. Not to remind myself of hurt, but to remind myself of the length of my endurance. People told stories about it for fuss, and some told them unkindly, and some told them with an admiration that felt strange. I moved on slowly in the way people rebuild. I started a small consulting side business and took a trip to New Orleans, the money I had been saving, and it felt like touching a small, stubborn life that would not be derailed by other people's choices. The last image I want to leave is the one that kept me walking in the days that followed. One afternoon, months after everything, I was on the balcony of my apartment, and the city below me moved like someone exhaling, and I saw Michael across the street, walking with no particular hurry, and he turned and saw me, and for a second, his face registered a small shock, and then a thin, unreadable expression, and then he kept walking. I reached up and touched the skin of my forearm, as if needing evidence that I existed, and the sun warmed my hand. The ending I allowed myself was not the one of simple triumph or cruelty. It was harsher and clearer. I had taken a life that was pretended, and made it visible, and in doing that, I had taken from him the comfortable cover of secrecy. He had chosen to make a split of two futures, and in the moment the world learned of it, his illusions collapsed, and he had to live in the fallout. I did not yell. I did not humiliate him in the street. I made a record and I opened a window so everyone could see what had been neatly hidden. The cost to me was heavy, the cost to him was also heavy, and in the ledger of consequences, there is no clean closure, only a hard, undeniable settling. I survived that settling, and when the dust cleared, I swallowed the taste of it, like something that taught me to be sharper and kinder to myself. The payback I orchestrated was public, and it stung him in the places he had relied on the most: his reputation, his future, his possibilities. And when he felt the falling apart, he understood that actions have a gravity, and that the choices that feel private can become loudly public when someone refuses to disappear. The city kept its music and the taco place downstairs kept its lime, and I learned to run along the lake again, and the world resumed its noisy, small business, as if nothing had happened, And in that continuing, I found a space to be 26 and then 27 and then someone who could love again on terms she set herself. If there is anything I learned, it is that when someone shows you who they are, you should believe them, and when they do something that leaves you small, you do not have to be small too. You can stand up and you can make the truth unfold, and it will hurt, and it will be messy, and it will not fix everything, but it will make clear what really happened. And that clarity is sometimes the only kind of justice you will ever get. I did not get him back, and I did not want him back. I wanted to be seen, and I wanted the people who had cheered us on to see what they had been nurturing. I wanted to keep the right to claim my life without being an afterthought. The end is this. The man who had proposed to me on a Friday and married someone else on a Sunday found that the life he had tried to split could not be split without cost, and that cost was paid in the only currency he had not been careful with: trust.